Reserve. The root of all our evil, it begins with the Federal Reserve. Hey, yeah, well, let's go back in time when everybody was so proud of a man.
I'm Tommy Salmons. This is Year Zero. Today, LB Muniz from the Been Awake podcast. I invited LB on to talk about nature versus nurture. He has an interesting perspective and an interesting idea of the Trinitarian when it comes to reason, faith, and I can't remember what the other word was, but I think it was emotion. But anyway, we talk about it in pretty good detail on the podcast. I'm just drawing a blank right now what the third word was, or the second word, whatever, however you want to put it. And then we talk about the origin of thoughts, which is something this podcast was really like about stupid fucking questions or philosophical questions that I ask myself during the day while I'm driving, and like some of the ideas I have, some of the thoughts I have. So it gets kind of deep, and it gets kind of like into the way my mind works and the way I think of things and how I view things, and kind of try to break things down and am trying to make sense of things I see around me. So I think you'll enjoy this. But first, RyanBunting.com. For all of your graphic design needs, go to RyanBunting.com. Ryan Bunting is a great libertarian and anarcho-capitalist. He's also a great graphic designer. He designed my podcast logo and Pete Quinones' podcast logo for Free Man Beyond the Wall. So go to RyanBunting.com for all of your graphic design needs and buy his book, Project Manicore. It's really good. Thank you, as always, Mr. Tom Burton, for the music. You get much love, and I appreciate all your support. So, everyone enjoy the show now. All right. I'm here with LB Muniz from Been Awake podcast. What's going on, dude?
Mr. Salmons, happy to be with you.
Yeah, man. I've been looking forward to this. It's very rare that I get nervous about a conversation, but it's kind of like the one I just had with Buck that I'll be releasing tomorrow. Mm-hmm. It's one of those ones I'm not certain I can verbally like confer exactly what I'm trying to say, you know? Okay. So it's like if I sat down for a few hours and started writing, I think I could probably at least convey like what my thoughts are on this subject, but I don't know if verbally I'm going to be able to communicate it as succinctly as I would like to.
Absolutely. Well, I think there's before we even get into the topic or even address it for the people on the show, I think it's worthwhile just maybe stopping there for a second and just saying that that's completely okay. Like there are these issues, and we're about to kind of get into, we're going to try and explore an idea, I think, in this conversation that is difficult to explore. Not only because of the, we might say some more basic political problems with it, right? It just comes off as poor form to some people, but also because I think it strikes at the heart of a lot of issues. And when you kind of get down to the bedrock of something is really when the stakes are higher. But I think what's important and what I view the philosophical process as is the investigation of these things. And sometimes the journey is just as important as the end goal, right? And it's a question of, or rather it's a matter of asking the right kind of question can lead us to a better understanding. So, I think like it and there's nothing wrong with not having the words for something. Like you said, that's one of the reasons why when I do my solo show, everything that I cover is what I write at beenawake.com. So I write about an idea and then I'll talk about it on a podcast. And that doesn't mean I don't like having a conversation or like flying by the seat of my pants. I really, really like it. But it does mean when I'm trying to work something out, I've really taken that to heart because I used to be somebody that said, oh, it doesn't matter. No, you need to write it out because there is podcasting is really cool, right? Live streaming is really cool. It's a really interesting way. It's a really fun way of working your way through ideas, but it's very dynamic, right? You're now sitting in real time trying to take the ideas in that I'm expressing. And then I'll likewise do the same thing when you're speaking. What the written word allows for is for you to say, okay, here's what I'm trying to say as best I'm trying to say it in this moment. Tell me what you think of it.
Right.
And that's not Twitter, by the way. That's not the purpose of what Twitter is or how you should use it. Right.
Agreed.
You know, a lot of us are on Twitter, which is why I'm making the point is that is what the long form written word, if you will, actually serves for us. And so this is going to be an adaptation of that, which is exploration. And like you were kind of saying before, just trying to work through something that's really, really important.
You know, and you bring that up, and one of the things that I've thought of the last couple of months is it's given me a new appreciation of Jordan Peterson, because I don't necessarily agree with everything he's saying or the way he's saying it or any of that, but to see somebody work through ideas live in real time every single night, every single day, it's really interesting. And it's very easy to find yourself working through an idea and expressing that idea poorly and offending half the nation, you know? So it's just a really interesting, you know, in itself, it's a really interesting idea to have somebody thinking out loud in front of an audience.
Yes. And I think one thing he proved is that there's a market. There's a demand for high level conversation that a mass audience can interact with, even if they don't understand all the nuances of it. And I don't think that's a problem. I think that's something natural and kind of revolves around the conversation that we're going to have here in a few minutes. But it's like, you don't have to know every single layer of intricacy to like glean some wisdom from something. You can appreciate. I was just before we got on, I was kind of sitting out in my backyard to try and soak up some vitamin D because I have a tendency to spend a lot of time inside. And I was, you know, just enjoying it. And I had on my headphones Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, right? Which is like the da 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 da. That's, if you know that, you know Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. But it's also like, you know, a 40-minute piece with multiple movements inside of it that I was just listening to, if I had to be honest, probably for the first time. I've certainly not listened to the entire thing in completion, maybe just like different pieces, different movements at different points in time. So like the same thing goes with ideas. And why shouldn't it go with ideas, right? There's layers of complexity that the best can actually go through and work through. And I think that's something that like the long form podcasting space provides. So, but let's get before we get too lost in the form, let's bring up the substance, shall we?
Yes. Okay. So you had brought up, and I'm going to look it up again because I want to make sure I don't misquote you. You had brought up that you are one of the things that you look into is instinct, reason, and faith. And I look at, like, I have this extremely deep desire to fulfill, or an instinct, I guess you could say, to fulfill this oneness with nature. Like, I'm always like, ever since I was a kid, my parents always said I could sit outside and just watch the grass grow. That was just the type of kid I was. And so I've always felt like this real, like, drawing or connection to nature. And one of the things I've been thinking of is the nature versus nurture argument. And when you touched on instinct, reason, and faith, with James Gentleman and Matt Erickson was when I really heard you bring it up, I was like, yeah, this kind of intersects with the question I'm asking, which is, where does nature end and nurture begin?
Yeah. So I think that, well, so let me back things up. So my conception in that I've presented it so far, and really this is like a schema, right? So I'm kind of laying out the skeleton or the boundaries of how we can try and view something as fundamental as like the natural drives of humanity, like what actually motivates us as an individual, as a group, what have you. And if you look at Enlightenment era philosophers and, philosophers from the scientific revolution to today, many of them categorize things in a binary in terms of two things, our instinct and our reason. And very unique to the Enlightenment, at least as far as my schooling has told me, right? I reserve the right to be wrong, of course. And I welcome criticism, but it wasn't just that we are instinct and reason, right? That we have this capacity, that we have these instincts and we have this capacity for reason. It was that if we ignore our instincts and focus on our reason, we can create a better society as a result, right? It's by not necessarily denying the instinct, but in some respects, literally denying the instinct. Because there was, as you might imagine, there was variation within the Enlightenment philosophers, just as there's variation within people thinking and talking about ideas today. So it was the big point was focusing on our reason. And that was the salvation of humanity, right? This, people might call it materialism. They might call it scientism. It has, they might call it rationalism. It has a few different names that it could take on. And each of those are their own school of thought with like unique elements to them. But the big point, again, to reiterate, is this binary, instinct and reason. And if we focus on instinct and we deny our reason, and if we push our reason down, if we push down our baser urges, right, we can create, again, a better society, a better life for people as a consequence. Moreover, this had like social implications, which was to say that ultimately it is only, like something like the classes, like the landed gentry that we would see in England, that the noblemen, the only thing separating them and the people was that they had access to things like education. So this is kind of all for the time. What I say, as somebody with the benefit of, a couple hundred years, an increase in our ability to measure the world, increase in scientific knowledge, generally speaking, philosophical knowledge, the benefit of people continually looking into these very subjects, right? So there's a couple hundred years between these great minds and then the people that we are today. And I say, okay, I think these people might have gotten something wrong. And one thing that they missed, or that they didn't realize, was that human beings, just as much as we have the capacity for reason, have a capacity for faith. And that faith, in many ways, I would argue, is the beginning point for a lot of the complexity that we have in our existence. And insofar, maybe even the fact that we have our capacity for reason or things worked out. And this goes along the way of thinking of, if we assume that there is order to the universe, we will find order. Whereas if we assume that there is only chaos in the universe, we will never find order, right? And so some people would say that it's because of like Christianity or other religious schools of thinking that, we were able to even have some kind of scientific viewpoint of the world to begin with. So that's kind of where I put forward this idea of instinct, reason, and faith, purposefully trying to demonstrate that things aren't necessarily a binary. But here's where it gets complicated, because I think the binary exists at the level of instinct, excuse me. So at the level of instinct, we always are fighting against this like binary of us and them. It's the lizard portion of our brain that controls fight or flight. So like that would be part of our instinct. The exercise of our reason is understanding how these things fit together and potentially overcoming them. So I guess that's my schematization that I think we can kind of play inside of, if you will, to try and answer the question of where does nature end and nurture begin?
Yeah. Okay. There's a lot there. So whenever I'm looking at this, and I'm looking at my instinct, like I said, which is to be like this one with nature. I don't know where that comes from. I don't know what that drive is. And then I utilize reason to find how to incorporate nature into my daily life. the faith I must have is in my ability to conquer nature. So I see where you're coming from. But when you're looking at where nature ends and nurture begins, it would almost be like, where does instinct and faith stop and reason take hold?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And the reason why it's a Trinitarian is kind of to complicate those matters. So like we might think of a Venn diagram, right? Which has like two circles that intersect in the middle. Well, you can have a Venn diagram with three circles as well. And suddenly you have a lot more intersecting ideas. Here's what's interesting. I bought myself a whiteboard recently, which I've kind of wanted one for a bit. I always enjoyed writing on them. And I actually tried to map it out, and it's sitting right next to me. And so I tried to map out instinct, reason, and faith in a Venn diagram with three of them all intersecting. And I was thinking that in the middle would be philosophy. But when I actually tried to fill stuff out, I didn't quite get there. I managed to fill in politics, theology, or politics, religion, and philosophy. But the center was still blank. I think that's kind of this is something that I'm kind of working out too. But like I said, this is a framework for how you act in the world, right? In a sense, this is a question of what drives you, not necessarily where you are going. So for the purposes of this conversation, right, you're focused on nature, right, and you're focused on being in nature, which generally speaking we can assume means like some natural state of like having forests and trees and grass and land around you, not necessarily being in a very population dense, like an area with a dense population level, like a city like Chicago might be, right?
You described my home.
Right. But so you have this call. And so maybe, and I don't know, because I don't know you that well, but like it's less a question of like whether you have faith that you can conquer nature, as opposed to the idea being that you have, at least in my, it does get muddy sometimes, because let me take one step back and give a secondary level explanation for why I think this matters, especially at a population level, is because what we witnessed, right? If you remove religion from people, and if you only focus on reason, and so you can kind of look at like the new atheism movement that sprung up in the 80s and 90s and the 70s as kind of a consequence, a manifestation of this, if you will, is this hyper rationalist way of viewing the world, such that we are going to completely dismiss all religion, of the benefits of all religion, just full stop.
Right.
Well, what do you see? Well, you see that people's faith still has to go somewhere. And for most of those people, for many of those people, it goes to what is almost always a very easy to the next most logical source of authority for them, which in most cases is the state, right? Which is the government, having faith in politicians or in the process, right? Your faith, for many Americans, your faith is in the Constitution. It's not necessarily even in the people in government, or even in the people in the political party that you vote for. It's actually in the Constitution. What you think, in some respects, and this would go more for like the Republicans, obviously, given the fealty they claim for it, the idea. But what you think is that the politician is acting in accordance with the Constitution, and so you can also put your faith in that person as well. Mm-hmm. But then it's a question of where my idea of bringing this, Trinitarian approach to things is to point out that your faith has to go somewhere. So maybe, perhaps better said, in your instance, it's not necessarily in the faith that you have that you can conquer nature, but just that nature will almost provide for you.
Yeah.
Right. Even if it's providing you just that general level of happiness.
Right.
And, and I'm somebody who, I grew up in the suburbs. I grew up in a far more suburban and urban environment. I live close to the city now, but man, sometimes I really wish I was in nature. And when I do find myself in nature, there is a happiness, there is a serenity to it. That I think is, that's worth exploring and not worth denying. It's also something that I feel like walking into a church or a house, or like really beautiful houses of worship.
Yeah, actually, my wife and I were talking about, this type of like mimetic kind of idea among society earlier, because I've for a long time, not always, but for a long time, I've considered myself agnostic. She considers herself atheist.
Mm-hmm.
So we're having this conversation about like going into like the really old school Catholic churches or the Greek Orthodox churches, and we're looking at pictures of them, and it's like they're so fucking beautiful. You know, it's like within itself, it's a spiritual experience, and that's kind of what I get from nature. It's like there's so much happening, and that's so big and broad, and you know, it almost conquers the spirit, you know, and it makes it's a spiritual kind of engagement that I have with the outside world in nature. Whereas if I'm in, like, I lived in Houston for 30 years and I hated it. I had planned for decades to move out into the country and garden and farm and
Right.
have, you know, whatever. And she makes fun of me because I'll go to like Tractor Supply to get a couple of things and I'll come back with like 10 more chickens or something like that. You know, because it's just like who I am. It's like, this is like what I want out of life. I don't want all that other stuff. I don't care about it. And so we got into a conversation about the materialistic world, you know, that we live in today versus the mystical world that had survived for thousands of years and kind of died after the Enlightenment. And I'm like, we have to understand that this wisdom that was passed down, the myth, this mythos that was passed down, no matter how you want to look at it, is important, and was important to mankind for centuries, for millennia. And we have lost a part of that I'm trying to figure out, what is it that we have actually lost? You know, I was like, when you look at, you know, political movements, they all have their talisman. They all have their sign of the cross they wear around their neck, whatever that may be, whether it's a face mask or whatever. I was like, and so whenever I'm looking at it, I'm trying to figure out where, like, what happened to create this divide between what we've learned and what we knew through, you know, intuition or, you know, instinct, and
so let's
they
pause
interact.
there for a second. Let's pause there for a second, because I don't know that there's something to be said for that. Instinct is like learned reason passed on genetically, in a sense, right? Like, other than like your emotional, like to the degree that we know we need to fear snakes as humans, which I understand is pretty like endemic to our species, is that most primates fear snakes because they're a natural enemy. Some cults of humanity, some ancient people still revered the snake, but it was always within the context of it kind of being the source of power, the source of fear. So the other reason why, so I started by talking about the way the Enlightenment viewed these things, which is very separate. One thing that the Trinitarian, I think, way of conceptualizing these drives does is remove that separateness from it. I wouldn't argue that it's useful to think of these things as exclusive, but more how they cohere. Like, it's kind of like the transmission of your car, right? In a sense, right? Because the transmission of your car has many different components that are working together simultaneously to drive your engine, to make your vehicle go forward. But we can also take a transmission apart to figure out where something's going wrong within it. It's in that way that I think we should take a look at these ideas. And but that's an exercise of our reason. The very easy thing for us to do is take two ideas and say, okay, well, there is this and then there is that. And what are the differences between this and that, and like making them appear to be so separate. So like I had this thing that I drew out, which is kind of like, there's, think of two towers, right? And you can be on the roof of one tower, or you can be on the roof of another tower, or you could be on a tightrope in between the two towers. Most people, in most instances, and in fact, in our actions, we oftentimes will be somebody on one tower or the other, right? Because at some point you're actually driven to make a decision. So somebody can sit and pine for their whole life of being like, oh, I'd be happier if I lived in the country and had a coop of chickens. But if they never do that, then they're still on the tower that says I'm going to live in suburbia and be miserable, if you will. Or if it's the choice between living in the city and living in the country, you're still living in the city. Even if you think the grass is greener over in the country, you're not actually taking that step to move to the other side. Philosophy, in a sense, is doing that trapeze or that tightrope act in between these two ideas, but also demonstrating that there's where the connections are between them and the dissimilarities. But it's also kind of a dangerous thing because we might go too far one way or too far another way, right? And of course, if we're having the conversation of where does nature end and nurture begin, like there have been some really bad ideas brought up in the past of human history about what to do with this question that have brought out the deaths of millions of people. So it kind of makes sense that a lot of people are going to react against having a conversation like this. And so let me to make the audience a little more aware of where I kind of stand. I was somebody who would have said it's almost entirely nurture, probably 10 years ago, as a consequence of my upbringing and my schooling and the way it was. I now would say I'd certainly not. I don't know that I would need to put a number on it. There's different numbers you can put if it's going to be between 0 and 100. I think the important thing for people to realize is that both exist, right? Where you set the level inside of that is irrelevant to an extent, right? If you believe something's 100% nature, well, then everything is predestined, and there's nothing you can actually do to change everything. If you argue everything is 100% nurture, well, you're actually kind of in the same issue. You're kind of in the same point, aren't you? Because if everything is 100% nurture, then all you have to do is set the right things out there, like, I don't know, free college for everybody, and you get to and you're going to fix the problem. Right. If we just guarantee loans, then people get into a home, then people will live a better life, because we did a study and we know that people who have homes tend to have more stable forms of income, and their children tend to go earn more, and blah 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 blah. The question is, where did these things start? And again, some people will say 50-50, some people will say 80-20. I don't think that really matters, because what you basically have to do in the face of this information is contend with the fact that you have a nature, right? That we all have these different psychological temperaments that manifest themselves in certain behaviors, right? And there are different ways in which psychologists have tried to measure them. Along the Jordan Peterson route, I tend to think that the big five makes a lot of sense. It tends to map onto my conception of reality as well, right? Like these different personality traits that people exist in different, with varying degrees of ability inside of them. But then the nurture obviously is there too, because we know that you can help people with certain things. There are people who, quit smoking cigarettes after 50 years. There are people who lose a lot of weight and keep that weight off. There are those exceptions that kind of change, that can show you the capacity for change. This also, given that we're talking about it, this brushes up against the determinism versus free will argument. And again, I think it's not an exclusive categorization, right? So something else I would have said in that conversation was something I learned in a logic class a long time ago, which is that the Greeks' conception of or had an inclusive and an exclusive sense. So we tend to view or as being either or, right? But we can also say something as either and. We don't really have this as clearly in English, but it can be one thing or another, or both, or neither. That's right. 4 categorizations in an apparent binary. And recognizing that complexity kind of puts you in a different level. Right now, what you're doing is you're exercising your capacity for reason. And part of that and it is a literal exercise, right? It is a matter of making sure you're hitting the right steps in your train of logic to make sure you put together what we would then call the best argument or case for something. So like the part of the reason why I wanted to stop you is because there's this inherent in this narrative around like well, the reason to the detriment of instinct, right? And if we're going to lift up reason and cast down instinct, it's this idea that, well, just because it was a priest saying it 100 years ago means it wasn't as true as some second year science student who does a study.
Right.
And I think that's a mistake, and I've always viewed that as a mistake, and I didn't like the way it was presented in school. And so I've come up with, and as kind of as a consequence of just witnessing the reality of the fact that most people are just figuring out the right thing to say in a situation, right? And good on them for it, right? You don't have to be the philosopher to have a good life. I don't believe that for a second. And in fact, sometimes if you want to try and figure out the worst, if you want to try to figure out where the line is, you're suddenly at a position where, like, holy cow, it's a lot more of the other thing than I thought, right? Like with nature and nurture, it's like, holy cow, like seriously, because I looked into it and it's like, holy cow, a lot of it is nature. Like, and I think that's the mistake that a lot of people who are talking about political issues run into is, and certainly what I have come to believe is, a lot of this is manifestation of psychological temperament. And that changes the way you interact with somebody, because now it's not a question of reason, right? It's not a matter of us having this open exchange of ideas and you changing it. If somebody's temperament means that they're going to disagree with everything that I say, well, then I don't approach that situation the way I would this conversation that we're having, which is because the concept is an open exchange of ideas, and that is what we're trying to have.
Well, yeah, and when you explain it like that, I can kind of see a symbiotic relationship between instinct and reason, or nature versus nurture, whereas they need one to operate for the other, like for the other to operate functionally. You have to have the nature. You brought up the snake. I was laughing, and I wasn't laughing at what you were saying. I was laughing because I damn near stepped on a snake earlier.
Right.
He wasn't poisonous. I was whatever. I was like, you son of a bitch, you scared me.
But it's so funny because we're talking about the urban rural thing, and this just popped into my head. Is like, here is part of the difference. There's a piece. It's like I have like a list of headlines that I haven't written yet, and one of them is like this. Like there's this concept of like being parochial, right, or having like a parochial education, which the implication is that it's very how would you say, narrow, right? So like you might know your mathematics, but you don't know anything about Greece, right? You don't know anything about how the rest of the world works. And this is, generally speaking, an idea that the urban elites point out at the rural, at the dumb rural people, right? This is a very, we don't have to spend too much time belaboring the point, because we would both agree that it exists. There isn't but we've progressed to such a state in society that there is that effect in reverse as well, right? Where now the parochial people are the urbanites. They are the people who have spent their entire lives in a city, and they don't actually understand what nature even looks like, right? Because to them, nature is Central Park. And so there's this, so you might say to the person, listen, and I have the luxury of traveling and interacting with people from multiple walks of life, from rural, urban, different social economic classes, where I kind of interact with people at different levels. And I've met people who like have never been on a plane before, and I kind of have that, you have that reflective moment when something like that occurs. And it's like, oh, okay, I have this knowledge that you have no way of conceptualizing because you've never experienced it. That also works in reverse. And I think what's cool is the degree to which technology has progressed is now you're kind of hearing that come back, which is part of the feedback effect, and I think ties into populism. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Because now you have the same microphone that a professional musician and a professional politician is using when they go on stage.
Yeah, exactly.
You have the same exact technology at your disposal, and this is why we're witnessing a lot of the big stuff around us happen.
I was laughing one time. I went out to I think I was in Wyoming, might have been Montana. I don't know. Like I said, I was an over the road truck driver. I've been to a lot of states.
Yeah, I know what that is.
But so I was in one of these like empty states where there's nothing out there but like and moose and wolves, and I stopped at a truck stop, and the guy, he was wearing a hat and it said something like, I don't call 911, I call 357. And I kind of laughed. And he's like, what are you laughing about? And I was like, your hat. And he goes, oh, you like it? I was like, oh, no, it's just, I was like, it's funny because I know all these people in New York City or in Los Angeles that have never experienced nature want to disarm you. And y'all have literal monsters out here you have to contend with.
Yeah.
You know, and you got to even the playing field in some way, shape, or form.
But right, exactly right. It is this like complete and utter ignorance. Now, I think one thing that I do as a skeptic, as like a philosopher on the skeptical side of things, is I in many ways embrace that ignorance. And I understand that that most of us always are living in a state of ignorance. Right. So you're having that guy, but you know, that guy doesn't know what it's like to live on like the west side of Chicago where all the guns you ever see are in the hand of gangbangers. And that one of those gangbangers shot your kid. So what happens is these two people who would probably never meet, right, are now suddenly supposed to have this national conversation. And in fact, they can be connected in technology, that can be connected by technology, but connected in such a way that they are actually disconnected from the person and they're only faced with the idea. So they see now a symbol of hatred in the fact that this guy's going to get his 357 and not call 911.
Right.
Right. And then he would see the reverse in that. And it's that, again, the natural us them impulse that is always at play at the level of instinct can be overcome, can be reconciled through the use and practice of reason. And it can also be overcome through the use and practice of faith. And
Right.
and what faith in this instance, you know, in that it tends to manifest itself in religious practice and religious worship. What religion does is it gives you the answer. So you're looking for an answer. Well, here it is. We have, you know, here are our answers to the questions. And, you know, we're not going to say this, but you can go down the street and there's another church that has very similar answers to the same questions, but maybe they're going to differ a little bit. And then even if you go to the same exact church and one town over, it's a different preacher there, and his thing is going to be a little bit different as it is. You know, I've talked about being raised in the Catholic Church. I don't think it's an accident that I have this Trinitarian conception of things as a consequence of it, because we're taught a lot in Catholic school to reflect upon the mysteries of our faith. Right? It's not a question of reason when you actually move into the religious sense of things, and that's okay. But let's make sure we put things in their proper category. Where does this connect? This connects to the conception of mysticism that we're seeing right now in the broader liberty space. And there are a lot of people who are introducing themselves to mysticism and the way you communicate in mysticism that is very different from the exercise of reason. But it looks very similar, but it's very different. It's actually very different in practice because it, by definition, doesn't have as explanatory power. But you know what it does do? It speaks to your soul, right? It speaks to the baser levels of your instinct of who you are as a person, right? And this grand cosmic narrative. You know, the people like Descartes looked at this impulse and said that this is a justification for the existence of God. Well, Rene Descartes is also the person that gave us the Cartesian plane, which we use in algebra to do all that. He was a scientist. He was one of the scientific philosophers, and yet he used his philosophy to still try and prove the existence of God. A lot of people will, you know, take exception to that today, and that's all well and good. My point that I'm trying to draw here is that if we're going to talk about something beyond the nature of reason or beyond the scope of reason, we by definition aren't having a rational conversation, right? And that's what the mysticism does. And I'm entirely comfortable having a mystical conversation with people. I'm just trying to get this warning out there that it's not the same thing as reason, but it can look like it a lot.
Wait, don't take everything. My wife's taking my tobacco. I was like, I want to roll another cigarette, damn it. Yeah. Well, Descartes also had a saying. He said, I think, therefore I am. That was Descartes,
Yes.
right? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So we were talking about this a little bit ahead of time, and I did want to touch on this because I'm really interested in your thoughts to kind of prelude with a pun. who was it? There was somebody. I want to say it was Aristotle, but I'm horrible with names. Number one, and I'm not as well educated as I would like to be, and I am constantly working on that. So, who was it that said ideas? People don't have ideas. Ideas have people.
That's a great question. I don't remember who said it either. Different
Okay.
people have said it at different points in history.
Okay.
And Matt brought that up in our conversation. Matt Erickson of King Pill brought that up in the conversation we had on James Gentleman's Blackbird podcast. So you can go back and look. I think he cites it there. But I, that is not the. It's an interesting way. It's an interesting turn of phrase, right?
I don't know if it's necessarily a turn of phrase, and this is I'm almost willing to accept it as literal, but instead of ideas, I think the term should be thoughts. People don't have thoughts; thoughts have people, and I say that intentionally. My wife's fucking with me. I say that intentionally because when your thoughts are a result of incorporated knowledge, right? They're not a result of you just coming up with something, right? You take in knowledge and you conglomerate useful knowledge, separate non-useful knowledge, and you come up with thoughts, ideas, and stories, whatever, through the act of incorporating knowledge into your life. And maybe I'm just weird, but it seems to me that in a lot of ways, like I pay a lot of attention to the way I interact with the world, and just very conscious. And maybe it's being out on the road for years and not
there's a correlation there, because I'm not in a semi, but I do like 4,000 5,000 miles a month, so you're not wrong to think there's a correlation there.
I'm just thinking, like, I was gone a lot and by myself a lot with only my dog next to me, and so there was a lot of times where no matter what I was doing, no matter who I was talking to, no matter what conversation I was having, the thoughts that had been building in my head are coming out of my mouth. No matter, like, I can find relation to anything. If I just read, like, I've been reading Crisis in Leviathan by Robert Higgs. No matter what conversation I'm having, I can find correlation with what I'm reading and what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And so I feel like thoughts are more this buildup and this complete dramatization of everything that you're taking in, more so than something that you're putting out. You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
Where they may contribute to you putting something out, but your thoughts are more than just what you're putting out. It's something that you're taking in. It's an exterior influence and not actually you at the really root level.
So where do you think because I completely agree with what you're saying.
Well, see,
I don't know if it's
so
what you're, hang on. So
no, I was just going to make a stupid joke. I was just going to say,
yeah,
I was going to say what I'm saying doesn't allow me to think. That's all.
So what you're saying is kind of like idea. So if we're going to say ideas or thoughts have people, let's just say that's what we're going to work for.
Okay.
I think your rationale for why is accurate, but I don't know that it follows that ideas have people. So what I'm curious is where, because this is such a part of my thinking. I did an episode, I recorded something years ago. I've written many times about how there is no way to think outside of the box, which you actually have. Like, you can't think outside of the box. What you can do is go find another box to think in. Right. You don't think for yourself. Just as a matter of fact, there is no box. There is no, you can build a bigger box. You can build a box right next to it, do an addition. There's a lot of things you can do. Right. But the point here is one of that. There has to be a structure for you to think in. And of course, people are going to think of that. So before I get too far ahead in what I think, what I'm curious about what you think is what what in your life, what story told you something different about that?
It's just my experience. I
No,
feel
no, 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 no. Sorry, because your experience is right about
I
how like we could. But so I'm curious where you
feel like
think we
what I was
learn
what I
that
was gonna
we
say.
don't have thoughts, or right, or what that we're unique to our thoughts. I don't know. I don't know the right way of putting it. Actually,
Yeah, no, that's it's a complicated like like thought experiment.
yeah,
Um, it, I feel like in my experience, I become captive to thoughts and ideas that
yes,
I'm not embracing them, that I am, that they are embracing me, that they are shaping me. I don't shape the ideas or the thoughts. They are shaping me.
sure,
Okay. So in a lot of ways, and in the way my mind works, in the way that I go through my day, I spend a lot of time in silence because I'm driving all the time. And so I spend a lot of time in silence, captive to my own thoughts and ideas, my own imagination, stories that I'm drawing in my head. And this started at a very young age. I mean, I started writing poetry when I was 12 or 13 years old. I started writing short stories when I was young. Like, I was captive to this, though, because once I focus in on what I'm doing, I can't stop. And if you stop me, I lash out at you
yeah,
because you are interrupting this stream of consciousness that I'm dealing with that has been enslaving me to its very essence, that I
yeah,
have to release it to break free from it.
mm-hmm.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So again, this is my experience. I don't know if other people experience thoughts and ideas this way or if I'm
Well,
just a weirdo.
I think creative people do, right? So there's an element of artistry to everything that I produce.
Right.
There's a reason why I make sure the audio is good. There's a reason why I'll do extra production work. There's a reason why when I do some pieces, I'll like reinforce certain ideas over and over again. Like I did, what was it? I said, after all, we're always sending signals like 6 times in a piece that I wrote recently, just by itself, because I'm trying to capture this artistic and meditative element to it.
Mm.
Because I'm trying to put people in a particular state of being,
Mm.
right? So here's how it comes back to our conversation. There are words that we use to describe the world, but ultimately we're trying to describe certain phenomena or things that we see.
Mm.
One of the ways in which we've taken this in the 20th century, and this was a very emergent, this is a very new way of thinking, which is an ontological one, which is fancy way of saying that things come to be, as opposed to, you might have heard the word deontological,
Mm-hmm.
which is to say that things are given as is, a priori, a priori or post priori. So,
Mm-hmm.
a priori is the same thing as deontological. Ontological would be post priori, because like more I don't think I'm using the Latin correct, but it's a matter of experience or empiricism.
Okay.
I think I tend to view many things in this dualistic sense of like yin yang, where it's never one or the other, and that's where the Trinity kind of comes in to help a little bit too. But I had this idea as it connected to, so what I'm very interested in is culture and identity, and like and so I tend to use an individualist frame to push these ideas forward, or to push the idea forward. I think there's something similar we can do, which is why I've spent some time building up the groundwork for like the categorization of what I'd call a school of thought. And there are always these schools of thoughts that have existed throughout all of human history, right? Some of them are just the focus of reason, which would be strictly philosophical. If you want to expand it, you could take, the more rational, you could take it to include religions as well, different ways of thinking, modes of being, in the modern sense, your dietary choice could be a part of this, but there's all these different things with schools of thought. And one thing that a school of thought does, okay, sorry, I thought I lost you for a second.
No,
For one thing that, one of the reasons why I use the term school of thought is that because the part of a school is to instruct people in the method. So it's less the non-formed conscious subconscious thing that we can do when we meditate, either in like the Eastern sense, where we remove words and ideas from our mind and we try to just focus on a single thing, or to empty our minds, or if in a more Western sense, which would be more akin to like prayer or close study of an idea, is another way of using the word meditation. So there is this chaotic, right? There is this chaotic element, which is the raw process of our consciousness. What gives it form? What gives it structure? What gives us the boundaries that actually create the area that we can play in and inhabit? Well, that's the function of the reason. And that is us bringing, if you know, in a allegorical sense, bringing order to chaos. And I don't accept this conception of left and right, order and chaos being so diametrically opposed. It's too easy. And I think as somebody who lives in nature, you would agree that while nature is very beautiful, it's also very dangerous. And you could easily, you know, if you're not careful, you could lose. I think you said you've had chickens a couple of times. You could lose your chickens to some wolves or to a fox if you don't take the proper steps to care for them. Raccoons, right? Is exactly like but it's so like you, but it's not one thing, it's not the other. It's always a mixture of both. So I think to like bring it back to the question of instinct to reason, or no, excuse me, not instinct and reason, of nature and nurture, is the mistake comes in our conception of trying to think of these things as exclusive, right? How can we put them together in a way that actually gives us good explanatory power, but doesn't like, you know, create a genocide? That's what I think is the mark of of whatever's coming next is going to have that characteristic. Because listen, it makes it because it fights. This also fights up against what is a very noble, if you will, but like this leftist impulse of egalitarianism. Right. You know, and so like, again, left and right are not monoliths, right? That's the natural structure of our brain trying to take over and make things too easy. We know things are more complicated than they appear because we have enough human history to look back on and realize that's the case. Right. So exactly. Then, so because I know I just put a bunch of stuff out there, but the point, the summation is, be careful when you're talking about mysticism. It's not an either or when it comes to nature and nurture, which is why you should make sure, which is why, you know, if you're going to procreate, you should make sure the person you're procreating with is a decent, stable person. You should make sure there's a confluence of values. I just wrote at beenawake.com this week about how one of the things I think we're witnessing in this political realignment we've been inside of since like 2014 is probably where historians will actually peg a date, much in the way that U.S. history is taught up to 1873, if memory serves, or 1877. And then it's taught after 1877, which is basically the reformation of the United States in the national identity, which would be different from like the constitutional order. This is in the same way in which, you know, people who know Scott Horton know he refers to the Iraq War I, Iraq War II, and Iraq War III. Yep. It's a helpful way of conceptualizing things. And that's the exercise of reason, is laying out the markers on the road, if you will, and trying to delineate what we actually see.
Right. Yeah. But at the same time, we have to be aware, and this came to me whenever you were just talking, that maybe it isn't that everyone is captive to ideas and thoughts.
Correct.
Maybe the majority of people are captive to the material world around them, and there's few of us that are captive to ideas and thoughts. And so thoughts have us, but those people don't have thoughts.
Yeah, but then you have I don't think, see, those people.
I think that's a really like poor way of saying it.
No, you're onto something. Hang on. So like, because people don't have thoughts. That's something that, you know, that's something that some people will talk about. There's a reason why I say there's a capacity for reason. And then there's a reason why I've been talking about instinct as just being, in that it just exists. Reason is the muscle, right? It's something that needs to be worked out. It needs to be used. It needs to be, needs to be stretched and molded and turned into something that's strong. It's not the case. For some people, it would be the case that biologically you're just going to have this inclination towards reason. right? It's part of the messy accident of the distribution of different traits and factors that we can that we in consequence measure and call science. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Right, like this natural, this messy evolutionary process that takes place over tens of thousands of years manifests itself in tiny measurable differences between individuals, but we can still categorize within that. And
Right.
we as human beings, being such complicated creatures, it's even more complicated than how it would be like categorizing groups of finches.
Right. And I think that's where I'm like my catch up here is not on identifying other people, it's on identifying myself. And like you said, we're so complicated that the more introspective I get, the more questions I have. I wrote a piece years ago for a buddy of mine who used to run a podcast, and he had a website. I don't know if it's still up or not. I haven't talked to him in a while. But it was called "The More I Learn, the Less I Know."
Yep.
And I was talking about how the more information I take in, the more I realize that's out there that I have no idea about. The more ignorant and idiotic I feel. Like it almost feels like after I read a book and complete a book, I'm like less inclined or less motivated to podcast because I feel stupider than I was before I read it. I felt so sure of myself prior to reading this book. And now I read this and I'm like, I don't know a fucking thing. I don't know why I'm doing this anymore.
I feel like that too. I really do. It's a very natural thing. I mean, and it's been systematized, right? So here's this natural inclination that a lot of people have experienced, and then somebody came up with a name, and that name gives its power, and it's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Right. And so the Dunning-Kruger effect is basically like, if you read a little bit, you're going to think you're way more well-informed than you actually are. Right. And it's kind of, but in that it's mapped out, it goes up, and it's on the two axes. One of the axes is your willingness to talk about something, and the other axis is the amount of knowledge that you have. And what you see is there's an inverse correlation. Is when you learn a little bit, you want to talk a lot about it, but then as you learn more, you don't want to talk about it. Then it evens itself off eventually, where you will talk more about it because you've reached some level of if you will, mastery. Expertise on an idea or a subject.
Exactly. And I do that. I struggle with that all the time. And I'm like, oh God, I got to record this podcast. And I just finished this book. And I found like the solution to this is to stop reading, but I'm addicted to reading. So.
Yeah. Well, it's also a question of processing and like what's actually on your mind, and so there's an element of that. Yeah. But I think you bring up another good point, which is, so I like to try and present ideas in a way that they can be useful. Right. And this is why you should look at things when you're looking at the information you're taking in, you should be looking at it the way you look at food.
Right.
You have an intellectual diet, the same way you have a diet of the people that you spend your time around, right? Show me your friends, I'll show you your future. Yeah. Right. And so if you look at yourself and you realize that you're and there's a very easy example of this, which is like cable news. Yeah. Like, look at the way people, like, I think one thing that a lot of us podcasters, no matter the size of our show, have is that we don't participate in the cable news structure the way that we would have 10 years ago or did 10 years ago, because we have so much more available to us.
Mm-hmm. I haven't turned on that TV in probably 4 years.
Right. And then and you can do that and still have like an informed opinion about stuff, right? Was it Mark Twain, who's one of my favorite historical figures? But he had if the person who doesn't read is unread, and the person who doesn't read is uninformed, and the person who reads is malinformed. And he was talking about like the New York Times, or something like that. And and that's what we're also trying to do with this thing. Like, cards on the table. I have a show because I think I can put things in such a way that people will find value in it, right? That I can, and that specifically I can organize ideas in such a way. So we were talking about this idea of ideas having this concept. See how like the language starts to get, the more esoteric we get, the tougher the language it is. Yeah. For like the clarity of language is lost. But so we have this concept of ideas having people. Okay. Let's reframe for a second, because it's still, like you just pointed out, it's you having the question. which is the point that Descartes talked about. It's not the case that it's this lofty individualist notion. It's the fact that when Descartes removes everything else from his mind, when he starts from a place of complete and pure skepticism, such as he's able to put himself into, right? Because he even says, he's like, I obviously can't do everything, but I'm trying to do this as best I can. He says, I have to start with the fact that I am thinking and that I am having thoughts. It is the case that those thoughts come from somewhere, right? But him, being the one putting those thoughts onto paper, makes it unique, makes it individual, makes it an expression of I, right? Of the one, of the unique individual unit that, again, over millennia, it manifests itself in the arc of human history, right? You know, that produces people like King William the Conqueror and produces people like George Carlin, right? Like, just
you're not
two men that are,
you're not telling a new story. You're telling the same story from your perspective.
in many respects, yeah, there's always that element of what is old will be new again. There is a time to all things, and that is an important thing to remember, because it gives you a sense of humility, which is also what religion does, right? So religion gives you the answers. It says it's prepackaged and here you go, right? It also says be humble, motherfucker, because God already figured this shit out and you're just a dirty little peon. You're just a sinner. Right. The humility is an important aspect of this as well, especially when you get into the realm of mysticism, because God help me, it's real easy. It is real easy to talk big, to talk a big game when you know how to speak in that language. And it's why we see it, which is why everybody has a story of a preacher or a priest or, a quote unquote man of God. I have one that I've told a couple of times before, where some pastor, like a customer of mine that I sold suits to, but this was a few years ago, he brought a pastor in his church in, but he was visiting from like Africa or something like that. And it was just kind of like the guy was like, oh, I spent so much money in the store. He never actually did. He would basically just shop the clearance rack and would buy stuff, but still. Well, so we go up, I give them all the discounts. We're having a nice, pleasant experience. I had long hair at the time, which comes into the story, and a little bit bigger of a beard than I do right now. But so we're sitting up at the counter, and the guy, and the pastor kind of goes, oh, I'm going to go back to such and such a place and I'll say prayers for you and you'll have many blessings. And I'm just kind of like, well, whatever. And then he goes to me, and then it goes like, oh, okay. Can I get more of a discount? It's like, oh, hey man, I promise I've given you every single discount that I can. Right. And they're trying to do the barter thing, whatever. It's all well and good. That was the job. So the pastor goes to me, are you a Jew? You look a little Jewy. This man, and like he was making a joke, but he was making a very anti-Semitic joke. Right. I guess I do kind of have that look to me, but I'm not. Right. And in the moment I felt like saying something like, yeah, but the men of God that I know take a vow of poverty. So they don't have nice suits or flashy rings on their fingers. Right. Right. But yet you're ostensibly a man of God. We all know that just because you call yourself something, that doesn't mean you are the thing. You shall know a tree by its fruit, is what the good book says. Right. So what you do is you don't necessarily look at the tree. You have to see what fruit these things are bearing. And again, I kind of offer this just as a warning, because I see a lot of people slipping into a mode of conversation that can be very dangerous, to just be simple about it. Right. Yeah. And not as honest as you would want to be.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's why I brought up I have considered myself agnostic, and my wife considers herself atheist, is because one of the things I told her earlier, I said, look, my only issue with atheism has always been they throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's wisdom there that a person that is self-reflective can look at and humble themselves to say, there's something here that I can learn. I don't know everything. I can learn something. And that's why I've always had an issue with atheism, is because they're basically saying, no, I know enough. I don't need you. Your wisdom, it worked for millennia, but it's no good for me. And it's like, no, there's something there. There's a reason why these stories lasted.
Yeah.
So much of the focus of my podcast is to point out abuses of power and how bad things have gotten and the direction in which we're heading as a society. And it can be a real black pill I've partnered up with Richard Grove to offer my listeners an opportunity to sign up to his Autonomy Course. The Autonomy Course is designed for people looking for solutions, people that want to shape their own future, people that are not willing to be at the behest of large corporations or the United States government or the banking system. The Autonomy Course is designed for those of you who wish to have complete control of the reins of your life, who are looking to be successful, that to thrive and not just survive, to provide for your family by utilizing your existing skills and learning how to market and sell those skills in order to be your own boss, or learn new skills in order to leverage that into a new career opportunity. So if there's a job out there you've been trying to get or you've been wishing you could get, but you just don't have the skills for it, the Autonomy Course is the place for you to start, to learn how to land that position, to learn how to market yourself better, to gain confidence, and to be surrounded by a community of like-minded people that will encourage you and help you along the way. So use my affiliate links and go check out the Autonomy Course. It could be right for you.
I would say it's useful to think of yourself as a being that thoughts take over if you haven't lived in that space before. Right. So if you as the listener, if you as the person listening now have never really conceptualized where your thoughts come from, it's like, okay, well, so how do you do that? Well, you should examine the people you listen to. Right. So if you listen to somebody like Dave Smith, which a lot of us listen to, you might notice that you say things similar to how he says things. Right. Or maybe your sense of humor is similar to him.
Yeah. I listen to way too much Legion of Skanks. I won't lie.
Yeah, me too. Right, I enjoy the show, but it's so
hilarious.
It kind of gives it kind of, but like so like there's a way of talking there that you wouldn't necessarily talk elsewhere.
Yeah, I work for a retail company now. I can't say some of those things.
But right, but here's the but the thing is like, yeah, so you're a consequence of these things that you're kind of taking in.
Right.
And if you've never been there, but don't stay too long in that realm, because that's also a very easy way. If you stay too long in that realm, suddenly you're in this like in between place where you are simultaneously like a god, right? Or you are just the pawn of forces beyond your ken.
Right.
Now, the latter is probably more true than the former, but there is an element to both, which is again this idea of the tightrope between things that I was trying to emulate, that I was trying to bring out earlier.
No, I thought that was a really good analogy that you brought up, and like I was thinking when you were saying that, and I didn't comment this when you were saying it, and I should have. But from the tightrope, you can see both perspectives. You see the nuance involved. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I thought that was a really good analogy.
Here's another one: is icebergs, right? But if you go deep, maybe it looks like you're on two different mountains, but then when you go down into the ocean, you realize that the icebergs are connected.
Yeah.
Right. We might say that that's most Republicans and Democrats. And we can sit as libertarians off to the side and be like, haha, look at you guys. But then you also have to recognize that most people are on those icebergs.
Well, these icebergs, so to speak, have shaped the language and opinion for decades. And this is one of the things I've been on about on Twitter for the last couple of days with this immigration argument. Is like, look, you don't understand. Your language, the way you're talking about this subject, has been shaped by those in power in order to give them more power. So It doesn't matter if you say I'm, closed borders or open borders or no borders. You're talking about their borders. You're not talking about your own borders, And so,
except most people are thinking of them in terms of their own borders.
Most people are, but the fact of the matter is the language does not line up, and I've been pushing, for people to go reread or read for the first time Politics in the English Language by George Orwell, where he gets into the way the politicians corrupt in the English language and transform it into the rhetoric they want to hear so that they can shape the policy to fit their means.
Yes. Right. Yeah. And it's important to recognize that, like there's this there's this like weird thing when you're brought up in American schools where you believe everybody is unique and anybody can be anything, but then you're also not supposed to believe that people are like trying to manipulate you or like influence you, and that it doesn't, and like, oh, we thought about this. It's I had seen this before of like studying Edward Bernays, and somebody, it's like, you know, a screenshot of somebody's lecture, and it was something to the extent of like, now we used to think like this 100 years ago, that we could influence the mass of humanity, but today we don't think like that anymore. Like, what?
Really?
No. The real answer is that we absolutely do. And so here's the lie here. It's like, no, like people have been spending billions of dollars to figure this out, and their name is Coke and Pepsi. Like, so of course elements in the government are going to do it as well.
Yeah.
Like, holy wow. You know, and what we have at the benefit is the beneficiaries of this information is like, we understand a lot more about like behavioralism. I remember I've had this thought. I had this thought, like it was like an intro to psychology course, and I was always interested in behavioralism. This would have been like 10 years ago or something like that now. But you know, the psychologist at the front was like, well, you know, and like, we're just not really interested in behavioralism anymore as a field. And so I'm like, oh, okay, I guess I'm not interested in psychology anymore. When of course the opposite was the case. There are plenty of people studying behavioral impacts of psychology in the fields of like marketing and various other avenues. But like this one guy said like, oh, we don't do it anymore. So I think that that's the truth, because I'm just some dumb 18-year-old kid at the time.
Yeah.
A very intelligent 18-year-old kid, but a dumb 18-year-old kid at the time, because I didn't know any better. Right. Yeah. And that's still something that we fight. That's still something that we fight. Another thing about the immigration issue that I just want to hit on, as it relates to the larger conversation we were having just now, is there is also an element of your biological temperament at play, right? There is an element of your nature that might lead you one direction over another. And this was a big point Jordan Peterson talked a lot about, is the richer, as the general level of wealth rises in a society, it is not the case. The case seems to be rather, based on evidence, that biological differences maximize, right? And so so as we get richer as a people, as a society, as the general level of wealth increases, our biological differences are actually going to maximize, which means we're going to be more different based off of this like biological temperament that in turn will make you kind of seem crazy if you don't put it in the right perspective, right? Because then that black sheep in your family is just wrong because Facebook exposed them to misinformation. You understand?
Yeah.
And that doesn't matter if you're a libertarian family or a progressive family, right? If you're a libertarian family and there's one progressive in your family, Facebook and Twitter and the universities led him astray, right? Or vice versa, which is the far more common when you're in like a progressive or a conservative family. And so somebody just looks like the black sheep as a consequence of like misinformation. It's like, no, it could very well be the case that this person was brought to these ideas and they spoke to them in such a way because of something like biological temperament. Mm-hmm. How do we manifest how do we manifest the world? How do we create reality around that conception is something that I'm really trying to work on, because it changes the way you interact with people, right? You know, and frankly, it makes some things less funny, right? And it makes other things more funny. It says it leads you to some conclusions about like the mass of people that kind of that don't sit well with you, but that doesn't mean denying it is the best thing for moving ideas forward, right? So again, it's more of like a harmonization thing, and with like immigration, abortion, these massive wedge issues that the cathedral, that the central government uses to influence people, because it's always things like immigration and abortion, like those are the most important issues to people, right? It's about my guns or something. Like there's something that there's always these issues. There's always going to be a biological manifestation of this, which is to say that you can sit here and say that you want to go and live in the country, but I know a lot of people that would never want to live in the country, right? That they want to live in and they could be, and you can sit and say that they're wrong for it, but if it makes them happy to live in the midst of millions of people, who's to really say, right? Like who is the actual judge? Well, okay, now we can exercise our faith. We can go back to religion, and who's the final judge? It is God. It is not final judgment is mine, saith the Lord. It is not yours to decide. Yeah. Right. Well, we're kind of losing that, I think, in the times that we live in, but it's still worth pondering.
some of what I've said about people living in cities and needing to move out to, more of your rural settings is I've said that, like, what you've done is you've found yourself in a prison. It feels and I could be wrong here, but it feels like you have enslaved yourself to this particular position. And if you are a more liberty minded type of individual that wants to live freer than what you've experienced in your lifetime, then being in an urban environment is not where you're going to experience that type of liberty and that type of freedom, you know?
Yeah, because and there's two sides to that coin, I would say. As somebody who has the desires to live in a less populated area, like, so I think you bring up a very good point, which is for liberty-minded people. But then, of course, the question is everybody so inclined towards liberty, right? If we take an egalitarian look at the world, then of course everybody is equally inclined towards liberty. If we remove ourselves of the egalitarian delusion, we understand that maybe some people aren't as interested in that kind of an idea. And then maybe even in some cases, those kinds of ideas are more powerful in the sense that you're kind of outsourcing your certain, you're outsourcing a lot of who you are as a person when you give up the idea of liberty. But like, maybe that means there can be more of you. So, but leaving that aside, there's the other side of that story is like, okay, but if I am somebody of immense consequence and wealth and I live in somewhere like a city, I can go anywhere in the world, right? At the drop of a dime. I can get on a plane, I can charter a boat, I can get a car and basically go wherever I want as a consequence of the wealth that I have there. And I get this wealth by working and living in a city. So I think there's another side of the argument that goes that way. I do think to put a button in it, though, that even that person would have to admit it is better for them to have a homestead. But this might just be my way of rationalizing backwards, because I've always thought the best setup for me would be having like a ranch out, the working ranch out somewhere in the middle of nowhere that I'll eventually retire to, and then like a high rise in the city or or something like that I can like go for like business meetings and stuff.
Here's one of them.
Yeah,
this is the one that rode with me over the road.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, he hears me in here talking. He's like, I gotta go and say hi.
Yeah.
The big old baby.
I miss having dogs. I drive, like, I'm in sales, but I drive a lot and I'm in like a van and stuff, but I can't really have a pup with me, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But they mean a lot. But dogs is another great way of kind of seeing this balance between nature and nurture. Right. Malice brought this point to the fore, I think, in a way that was great, which is like, we co-evolved with dogs. So it does kind of make a lot of sense. I used to argue that, like, people would bring up like biological studies of rats and be like, yeah, but we're not rats, we're humans. As if that's not an argument. That's an assertion.
That's not what we're saying.
Right. Yeah. It's just, but the point there is just to point out that my thought has evolved on this based off research and evidence. It's not the case that I've been saying the same thing for a long period of time. And then the second point is that we do see it manifested in like our choice of companions, both canine and human, and how we kind of like choose the people we choose to surround ourselves with.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, buddy. Okay. Hello. He's like, you've been on for a while, dude. Are you done yet?
Yeah. Right.
Can I have some attention now? Can we go outside? I want to go outside. The last thing I really wanted to talk about and just touch on, because I think it fits in well with this conversation, and I'm sitting here looking at the book right now and it keeps catching my eye. And so I just felt like, maybe I should say something about this book because it's right there. Have you ever read the book Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell?
No, but I'm familiar with a lot of Gladwell's work.
I felt like when I read this book, it was like an epiphany.
Okay. What's his thesis?
The thesis is that the people that make extreme change in the world, or that leave a footprint for others to remember in history, are outliers.
Yes.
And so what he's doing is he's trying to summarize what it takes to raise your children to be outliers, to become the wealthy, to become the innovators, the entrepreneurs. And I remember there's this one passage where he's talking about being assertive. And he's discussing how poor people, on the whole, on average, raise their children to obey authority, whereas wealthy people raise their children to question authority.
Mm-hmm.
And so the entire premise of the book is how to maximize nurture in all seriousness. That's basically what he's getting at. How do you maximize nurture for future generations? Maybe you missed it. Maybe you missed the boat. Maybe you didn't get these gifts handed down to you, but you don't have to be the wealthy, the experienced, the best at anything to be able to give these tools to your children.
Yeah.
And I think that just offers a lot of hope for people.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Well, no. So what I should say to that is, well, other than agree, is also like, I've talked a lot about nature, but that's just because we need to contend with it. At the end of the day, it's kind of like the concept of nature and the nature versus nurture argument is that the nature part is set. Right. And I've said, the obvious point, which is that 100% of anything is rarely ever the right way forward.
Right.
So I don't consider myself a determinist. I consider myself somebody who I believe humans have free will. I think the degree to which any one individual might have what we would call free will can vary, but that doesn't change the fact that I think that there is something to the idea of free will. Where we can make changes and where we can make things better is in the realm of nurture. But contending with that is contending with how much change is really what the question is. So this goes. So I think if two people have a kid and they love each other and they want to make sure that kid has the best upbringing, that's the most important thing you can do, right? And what sucks about our day is that we're kind of reestablishing those sorts of rituals and practices that have been broken down, right? Just with the rise of like single parent family households and this outsourcing of the responsibility for childcare and child rearing to the state, which again, like I was kind of saying before, if you outsource, you actually can make more money if you outsource something, right? You can, you earn more on your resources, but there's diminishing returns to that. Because there's always diminishing returns. And so in the way that this like portends to like families is difficult. And I think, and I know that I'm somebody who's far too interested in ideas to the detriment of people. Sometimes I care about people in my life, but a lot of times, a stranger is just kind of an abstraction in the moment. And I work against that because I understand that that's not the right way to look at strangers. But like the realm of nurture is all that we have. But if you're pursuing a nurture that believes you can change 100% of somebody, you're going to lose your faith in the results. Right. I mean, you go and again, ridding ourselves of the egalitarian delusion means that completely reimagining the way we look at schooling and the way we look at education. What I've said is we seem to be in a time where there's that natural decentralization impulse, right? Given that there is a time for all things, right? You can, if you want to call this a turning, I don't really care, right? Because the Bible said there is a time for everything. There is Nietzsche talked about the eternal return of the same. There are seasons to our existence,
right?
There is the spring, winter, and fall and summer. There are all these. The label you put on it is kind of inconsequential from my perspective. The way that like the particular form of government is in many respects inconsequential, in that you as the individual are still faced with decisions that you have to make. And if you're interested and you're willing to take the journey, there's a lot of self-development and self-knowledge that comes along with that comes with it, as well as some hardship. But if you don't want to take the journey, then I'm surprised you've been listening to us for the last hour and a half. But those people do exist, and you have to contend with both. And again, to reiterate the point of nurture is nurture is what we have at the end of the day. So it does matter how you train. And like Gladwell's conception there is very, very useful for parents who are interested, willing, and able to take care of their kids. But again, with the egalitarian impulse in the public schooling system, just to make this concrete, because we have to move from the abstract to the concrete in order for things to have any meaning, is okay, what does that actually mean in practice? Right? For the vast majority of people, they're just sent to some random public school where, if they're lucky, they're going to have one good teacher. That's what it actually matters, because the system isn't set up for actually helping people. It's actually in many ways set up to keep us dumb.
Yeah, no, and I think you made some excellent points there. I think the number one thing I would like to leave here with is, and it's something that it took this conversation for me to functionally realize, which I probably already knew, but it actually makes a lot more sense, is the nature is constant. You can't change the nature, but you can change the nurture, and you can change how you interact with the world and what you put into yourself in order to shape how you interact with the world. So I think that is a great takeaway from this entire conversation.
And you want to know how you can make it more complicated?
No.
Is by remembering. I was already ready to jump into it.
No, go ahead.
No, is by remembering that like a drop of water can shape a boulder. And it is in that way that nature can change.
Yeah.
Just on a longer time horizon.
Yeah. No, I mean, depends on what your time preference is, I guess.
Yeah, there's a reason why the Austrian School of Economics is so powerful.
Right.
Is because it has all these little insights that were well ahead of their time.
Right. All right, man. Well, plug away. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you. Yeah, this was a lot of fun. If you liked anything that I had to say, please go to beenawake.com and subscribe with your email address. That is my Substack that hosts all my writings and my podcast. So you can find everything there. Once again, that's beenawake.com. And then you can follow me on Twitter if you want. If you like what I have to say, the LB Muniz, that's Muniz for all you gringos out there. And if you don't like what I have to say, screw you. And please, for the love of God, don't follow me and tell me why you don't like me.
Yeah, don't follow him. Just donate to him.
Well, that too, yeah.
Hate fund this motherfucker.
And if you want to do that, you go to beenawake.com/subscribe. I am offering a lifetime discount for anybody that signs up before the 1-year anniversary of my page, because I've been writing and producing for about a year now.
I thought you were going to say you were offering lifetime subscription for anybody that hates you.
Well, listen, money is money. I'll take it.
All right, I'm going to stop the recording.
If you're gonna play this game of pick and choose, well, it's a game that was made for you to lose. It doesn't really matter how many times, it's the same old worn out stories, same old lines. They're all pointing dirty fingers in hypocrisy, bragging on their feats of mediocrity again. Never really making any kind of change, but they keep on getting re-elected, and I find that strange. And that's why I say fuck them, don't feed them, cause we don't even need them. I never celebrate the tyrants that are taking our freedoms. Yeah, I said fuck them, don't feed them, cause we don't even need them. I never celebrate the tyrants that are taking our freedoms. What's it gonna take for you to see that we're living in a rigged democracy? People stand in line for the thieves that they've been choosing, paying no attention to the rights they keep on losing. But they all gather in the rallies and they chant their names on goddamn well that it's all gonna be the same. Just 4 more years of war and taxes, 4 more years of them grinding down their axes. And that's why I say fuck them, don't feed them, cause we don't even need them. I never celebrate the tyrants that are taking our freedoms. Yeah, fuck them, don't feed them, cause we don't even need them.